I've always been a man of routine. My name's Daniel, and for the last 12 years, I've woken up at 6 a.m., brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and kissed my wife, Laura, goodbye before heading to my job at the architectural firm. Laura's an artist, wild-haired, paint-splattered, and unpredictable in a way that used to charm me. We met in college, two opposites drawn together by some cosmic joke. She'd sketch me while I studied blueprints, and I'd tease her about her chaos. That was us, order and disorder somehow balanced. Or so I thought. Our house in Portland sits on a quiet street, all cedar beams and big windows, a place I designed myself. Laura's studio takes up half the basement, a riot of canvases and half-finished dreams. Lately, though, she'd been distant. She'd linger in that studio past midnight, her laughter replaced by a tight-lipped smile whenever I asked about her day. I chalked it up to her latest project, a commission for some gallery downtown. She'd always been consumed by her work. Last Tuesday, I came home early. A client canceled, and I figured I'd surprise her with takeout from that Thai place she loves. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, save for a faint glow leaking from the basement windows. I assumed she was painting, lost in her world. I grabbed the bags of pad thai and spring rolls, my keys jingling as I let myself in. The upstairs was silent, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. I called her name, no answer. Maybe she had her headphones on, I thought. She often did when she worked late. I headed downstairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The basement smelled of turpentine and something else, something sharper I couldn't place. Her studio door was ajar, and I nudged it open with my elbow, balancing the food in my hands. That's when I saw it. Not just her, but them. Laura stood there, her back to me, her auburn curls tumbling over her shoulders. She wasn't alone. There was a man, tall, wiry, with a mop of dark hair and a smug grin I'd come to loathe in the months that followed. His name was Eric, a sculptor she'd met at some art event. I'd shaken his hand once, oblivious. They weren't painting. Laura's shirt was half unbuttoned, her hands tangled in his hair, and he was pressed against her like he owned her. The takeout slipped from my grip, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Spring rolls rolled across the concrete. She spun around, her eyes wide, lips parted in a gasp. Eric stepped back, wiping his mouth like he'd just finished a meal. "Daniel," she stammered, her voice a fragile thread. I didn't say a word. Couldn't. My chest burned, my vision narrowed, and all I could hear was the blood pounding in my skull. I turned and walked out, up the stairs, through the house, into the night. I drove for hours, the city lights blurring into streaks. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from her, from him, from the life I'd built. By the time I stopped, the sun was rising over the Columbia River, and I realized something had shifted inside me. It wasn't just pain. It was something colder, something that whispered promises of retribution. I wasn't going to let this go. Not like this. The next morning, I didn't go home. I couldn't face Laura's excuses or the basement that now felt like a crime scene. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel off I-5, the kind with flickering neon signs and mattresses that smelled of regret. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone as it buzzed with her calls. 7, 8, 9 times. Texts followed. Asterisk, we need to talk. I'm sorry. Please come home. Asterisk, I didn't respond. I needed space to think, to piece together how long this had been going on. Eric wasn't a stranger. I'd met him 6 months ago at Laura's gallery opening. He'd swaggered over with a glass of cheap wine, complimenting my tie like it was some grand gesture. Laura had laughed too hard at his jokes that night, her hand brushing his arm. I'd brushed it off. Artists, I told myself, they're tactile. But now, every memory twisted into evidence. The late nights she'd blamed on deadlines. The weekends she'd spent at the studio while I worked overtime. The way she'd started locking her phone. I opened my laptop, the motel's Wi-Fi stuttering as I logged into our shared cloud account. Laura never was good with tech. She'd linked everything there. Photos, emails, even her calendar. I scrolled through months of data, my stomach tightening with every click. There it was, buried in a folder labeled Inspiration. A photo of her and Eric, taken 3 months ago. They were at a park, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Another showed them at a cafe, her fingers tracing his knuckles. Dozens of images. A timeline of betrayal I'd been too blind to see. Her emails were worse. Messages to Eric, gushing about their connection. Planning meetups at our house when I was away. One, dated 2 weeks ago, read, Daniel's working late again. Come over. I need you. My hands shook as I read it. This wasn't a fling, it was a second life, built behind my back. I slammed the laptop shut, the room spinning. I wanted to confront her, to scream, but that wouldn't be enough. She'd cry, apologize, and I'd still be the fool. I drove to a coffee shop downtown, the kind where no one looks twice at a guy nursing a cold brew for hours. I watched people come and go, couples, friends, strangers, all living lives I envied for their simplicity. My mind churned. Revenge wasn't a word I'd ever lingered on before, but it felt right now, like a tool I'd been handed. I didn't know what shape it would take, but it would be deliberate. It would hurt her the way she'd hurt me, deeply, irreversibly. That night, I called my brother, Mark. He's a cop, gruff and practical, the kind of guy who solves problems with his fists or a badge. I told him everything, my voice breaking only once. He didn't judge. You need to be smart, Dan, he said. Don't do anything rash. Let me dig into this Eric guy. See what he's hiding. I agreed, though part of me wanted to skip the research and go straight to breaking something. His face, her trust, anything. But Mark was right. I needed a plan. 2 days later, I went home. Not because I forgave her, but because I needed to play the part. Laura was waiting, her eyes red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She'd cleaned the basement, the takeout mess gone, her easels neatly aligned. Daniel, she started, stepping toward me. I held up a hand, stopping her. I'm here to talk, I said, my voice flat. That's it. We sat in the living room. The space we'd once filled with laughter now heavy with silence. She admitted to Eric, said it started as a friendship, grew into something more. She swore it was over, that she'd ended it the night I caught them. I was stupid, she said, tears streaking her face. I love you, Daniel. Only you. I nodded, pretending to listen, pretending to care. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every lie. I told her I needed time. She agreed, eager to please, offering to sleep in the guest room. I let her think I was broken, that I might forgive her eventually. It was a mask, convincing enough to keep her off guard. That night, I lay in our bed alone, staring at the ceiling. Her scent lingered on the pillows, a cruel reminder. My phone buzzed. Mark. Eric's got a record, he texted. Petty theft, some assault charges that got dropped. Works freelance. Lives in a loft downtown. I'll keep digging. The next morning, Laura made breakfast. Pancakes, my favorite, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. I ate in silence, watching her fidget. She asked if I'd go to therapy with her. I said maybe, letting her hope. After she left for the studio, I searched the house. In her desk drawer, I found a sketchbook. Pages of Eric, his face rendered in charcoal and ink. She'd drawn him like he was a god, every line reverent. I tore them out, one by one, and burned them in the backyard. The smoke stung my eyes, but it felt good. I started following her. Subtle at first, tracking her phone's location through an app she didn't know I'd installed. She went to the gallery, to coffee shops, once to Eric's loft. She didn't stay long, but it was enough to confirm she'd lied again. I tailed her in my car one evening, keeping my distance as she parked near his building. She glanced around, then slipped inside. 15 minutes later, she emerged, smoothing her hair. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Mark met me at a bar that Friday, a dive with sticky floors and dim lights. He slid a folder across the table, Eric's life in black and white. 34, divorced, a string of failed art projects and unpaid bills. The assault charges stemmed from bar fights. The theft was a boosted sculpture from a rival. He's a leech, Mark said, sipping his beer. Lives off people like Laura. creative types with money or connections. I flipped through the pages, memorizing details. Eric was a parasite, but Laura had invited him in. I asked Mark to keep it quiet. No police, not yet. This was personal. He nodded, understanding. Just don't do anything I'd have to arrest you for, he warned, half serious. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Back home, Laura was still playing the remorseful wife, cooking dinners, leaving me notes about working on us. I played along, asking about her day, nodding at her stories. She never mentioned Eric, and I never let on that I knew. I started planning. Revenge wasn't just about confrontation. It had to be artful, a mirror to her betrayal. Laura thrived on her reputation, her standing in Portland's art scene. Eric fed off it too, a nobody clinging to her coattails. I take that from them both. I spent nights researching gallery owners, critics, anyone who mattered in her world. I made calls, posing as a collector, planting whispers about her unprofessional conduct with a certain sculptor. Rumors spread fast in tight circles. At home, I kept the facade. Laura noticed my distance but blamed herself, doubling her efforts to win me back. She'd touch my arm, her fingers tentative, and I'd let her, hiding the revulsion. One night, she suggested a weekend away. To reconnect, I agreed, picking a cabin in the woods, isolated and quiet. She beamed, thinking it was a step forward. I saw it as a stage. I bought supplies, nothing suspicious. Rope, duct tape, a toolbox. I told her it was for cabin repairs. She didn't question it. Mark called again, saying Eric had been asking around about me. Nervous, maybe suspicious. Good. Let him sweat. I wasn't ready to strike yet, but the pieces were falling into place. We drove to the cabin that Saturday, Laura chattering about hiking trails and fresh air. I nodded, my mind elsewhere. The place was remote. Pine trees thick enough to swallow sound, a lake glinting through the branches. Inside, it was rustic. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace. No cell signal unless you climbed the ridge. Perfect. Laura unpacked, humming as she arranged groceries. I carried in the tools, stashing them in the shed out back. She didn't notice the weight in my steps, the way my eyes lingered on her. That night, we sat by the fire, her head on my shoulder. She talked about our early days, how she'd fallen for my steadiness. I listened, my hand resting on her knee, my thoughts on the next move. Sunday morning, I suggested a walk. She agreed, pulling on boots and a scarf. We wandered the trails, her hand in mine, the air crisp with pine. I led her to a clearing, a spot I'd scouted online. Secluded, surrounded by dense forest. It's beautiful, she said, turning to me. I smiled, then let go of her hand. Laura, I said, my voice low. I know you're still seeing him. Her face froze, color draining. She stammered, denying it, but I cut her off. I followed you. I saw. She backed up, eyes darting like a trapped animal. I stepped closer, pulling a photo from my pocket. The one from her cloud, her and Eric in the park. You lied, I said. Again. She started crying, begging, saying it was a mistake. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The calm in my voice scared her more. I told her we were done. Not just us, but her life as she knew it. She didn't understand yet, but she would. I walked back to the cabin, leaving her there, sobbing in the clearing. Phase 1 was complete. Break her down. Phase 2 would be worse. I had 10 more parts to play. I left Laura in the clearing, her sobs fading into the rustle of the pines as I trudged back to the cabin. The air felt sharper now, cutting through my jacket, but I barely noticed. My mind was a machine, gears turning, mapping out the next steps. She'd chase after me soon. She always did when cornered, but I had time. Time to set the stage. Inside, I locked the front door, not out of fear, but control. The cabin was my domain now. I dragged a chair to the center of the living room, facing the fireplace, and sat down with the toolbox at my feet. The shed supplies, rope, tape, a small crowbar, stayed hidden for now. I didn't need them yet. This wasn't about brute force. It was about precision. Laura's world revolved around her art, her status, her ability to charm. I'd dismantle that, piece by piece, and she'd watch it happen. The photo of her and Eric burned a hole in my pocket. It was my ace, proof she couldn't deny. She stumbled in 20 minutes later, her scarf trailing, cheeks streaked with tears. "Daniel," she gasped, slamming the door behind her. "We can fix this. Please." I didn't look at her, just stared into the fire, the flames licking the logs I'd stacked that morning. She dropped to her knees beside me, hands clawing at my arm. "I'll end it with him, I swear. I'll do anything." Her desperation was thick, almost tangible. I let it hang there, let her squirm in it. Finally, I turned my head, meeting her eyes. "Anything?" I asked, my voice a blade wrapped in silk. She nodded, frantic, misreading my calm for a lifeline. "Good," I said. "Start by telling me everything. Every meeting, every lie. Don't leave anything out." She hesitated, then spilled it. How Eric had flattered her at the gallery, how they'd started meeting for coffee, how it turned into late nights at his loft or our basement. She said it was emotional at first, then more. Her words vague but heavy. I listened, filing away details. Dates, places, his habits. When she finished, breathless and trembling, I stood up. "Stay here," I said, walking to the kitchen. She didn't follow. Too scared, too hopeful I'd soften. I poured a glass of water, not for her, but to steady myself. My hands shook. Not from anger now, but anticipation. Mark had texted earlier. Eric spooked. Asking mutual friends if you're unstable. Watch your back. Unstable. The word almost made me laugh. I wasn't unstable. I was a draftsman, and this was my blueprint. That night, I slept on the couch, Laura in the bedroom. I heard her pacing, whispering into her phone. Probably Eric, despite her promises. The cabin's weak signal didn't stop her desperation. I didn't interrupt. Let her dig deeper. By morning, she was pale, offering coffee like a peace treaty. I took it, sipping slowly. "We're staying another day," I said. Her face fell, but she nodded. She thought I wanted to work things out. She was wrong. Sunday bled into Monday, the cabin a pressure cooker of unspoken truths. Laura hovered, trying to read me, her apologies a broken record. I kept busy, chopping wood, fixing a loose shutter, anything to stay out of her orbit. She watched from the porch, twisting her scarf in her hands. I let her stew, let the isolation gnaw at her. Out here, she had no gallery, no admirers, just me and her guilt. Mid-morning, I drove to the ridge for signal, leaving her behind. I called Mark. "He's still sniffing around," Mark said. "Showed up at your firm yesterday asking if you'd been in. Said he's worried about Laura." I smirked. Eric wasn't worried, he was scared. "Good. Keep an eye on him," I said. "I need more." Mark promised to tail him, dig deeper into his finances. I hung up, then texted a contact from Laura's art circle, Rebecca, a gallery owner I charmed at a fundraiser. Heard Laura's latest works compromised. Personal issues. Might affect her show. Rebecca replied fast. Thanks for the heads up. I'll look into it. The seed was planted. Back at the cabin, Laura was sketching by the fire, her pencil scratching paper like a nervous tick. I glanced at the page. Another portrait, this one of me. She'd drawn my eyes cold, my jaw tight, accurate for once. "What's that for?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. She flinched, closing the book. "Just thinking about us." I nodded, letting her think it mattered. Didn't. Her art was her lifeline, and I'd sever it soon. That afternoon, I took her phone. She'd left it on the counter, unlocked. A rare slip. I scrolled through texts to Eric. He knows. "I'm scared. Don't come near the house." His replies were curt. Handle it. "I'm not getting dragged down." Coward. I forwarded them to my email, then deleted the evidence from her device. She didn't notice. too busy pretending everything was fine. Dinner was quiet. Her forced smiles met with my silence. She went to bed early, exhausted. I stayed up, planning. Mark called late, whispering like he was on a stakeout. Eric's in debt big. Owes a loan shark downtown. Been leaning on Laura for cash. That explained her withdrawals. The studio expenses she'd waved off. I thanked Mark, my mind racing. Eric's weakness was money. Laura's was pride. I'd use both. Tuesday morning, I told Laura we were leaving. She packed fast, relief in her movements, thinking the cabin was the worst of it. I drove us back to Portland, the silence between us thick as fog. She stared out the window, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. I dropped her at home, saying I had errands. She didn't argue, too drained, too afraid to push. I watched her shuffle inside, then pulled away. First stop, a print shop downtown. I had the photo of Laura and Eric enlarged, framed in cheap black plastic. Next, I met Mark at a diner. He slid me a burner phone and a USB drive. Eric's loan shark's name is Victor, he said. Rough guy. Eric's missed 2 payments. The USB had photos, Eric meeting Victor in an alley, hands raised, pleading. Leverage. I thanked Mark, slipping him cash for his trouble. He didn't ask what I was planning. He didn't want to know. I called Victor from the burner, my voice steady. Eric's got a new cash flow, I said. My wife. Check her accounts. I gave him Laura's name, our address. Victor grunted, interested. What's in it for you? He asked. Just want him gone, I said. Truth enough. He hung up, and I pictured Eric's panic when Victor came knocking. Step 1. Back home, Laura was in the basement, painting. I hung the framed photo in the living room, centered above the couch. She'd see it soon. I cooked dinner, her favorite salmon with dill, acting like nothing had changed. She emerged at dusk, paint on her cheek, and froze when she saw the photo. Daniel? She whispered. Why? I shrugged. Thought it looked good there. She didn't touch her food, just stared at the floor. I ate slowly, savoring her discomfort. That night, I heard her crying in the guest room. I didn't comfort her. I checked my email. Rebecca had replied. Asterisk heard from 2 collectors. They're pulling out of Laura's show. Rumors about her and some sculptor. Asterisk the whispers were spreading. Her career was cracking. Wednesday, Laura barely left her room. I heard her on the phone, voice low, pleading with Eric. I assumed. I didn't care. I went to work, drafting plans for a new office building. The normalcy a stark contrast to the chaos I was weaving. My boss asked if I was okay. Said I looked intense. I smiled, said I was fine. He didn't press. Mark texted at noon. Asterisk Victor paid Eric a visit. Roughed him up. Eric's freaking out. Blaming Laura. Asterisk perfect. I stopped by Eric's loft after work, parking across the street. His lights were on, blinds half open. He paced inside, a bruise blooming on his cheek. I snapped a photo, more ammo. He didn't see me. Too busy panicking. At home, Laura was a ghost. Pale, quiet, her sketchbook untouched. The photo still hung, a silent accusation. She asked me to take it down. It's staying, I said, my tone final. She didn't fight, just retreated. I checked her bank account online. Another withdrawal, $2,000, gone that morning. Helping Eric, no doubt. She was bleeding herself dry for him. I called Rebecca again, this time as myself. Laura's not stable, I said. She's tangled up with a guy who's trouble. Might tank her show. Rebecca sighed. I'll cancel it. Can't risk the gallery's rep. I thanked her, hanging up as Laura shuffled into the kitchen. Who was that? She asked. Work. I lied. She nodded, too broken to question. That night, I left a note on her pillow. Asterisk, your show's done. Check with Rebecca. Asterisk, I wanted her to feel it. The loss of her dream, the weight of her choices. She'd wake up to ruin. Thursday morning, Laura found the note. I heard her scream, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the house. She stormed into the kitchen, eyes wild, clutching the paper. What did you do? She yelled, voice cracking. I poured coffee, calm as stone. What you did, I said. To us. To me. She lunged, slapping the mug from my hand. It shattered, brown liquid pooling on the tile. I didn't flinch. She called Rebecca, begging, but the line was dead. Figuratively, then literally when Rebecca hung up. Laura sank to the floor, sobbing. You ruined me, she whispered. You ruined everything. I crouched beside her, close enough to smell her fear. You ruined us, I said. I'm just balancing the books. Mark called later. Eric's gone dark. Left his loft. Phone's off. Victor's not happy. I pictured Eric running, tail between his legs, leaving Laura to drown. She spent the day in the basement, emerging only to glare at me. I ignored her, ordering takeout, a cruel nod to that night. She didn't eat. By evening, she was packing. I'm leaving, she said, dragging a suitcase upstairs. I didn't stop her. Let her think she had control. I'd already emailed her collectors, her peers, anonymously, photos of her and Eric, whispers of her unreliability. Her network was collapsing. She'd have nowhere to land. As she drove off, I sat in the dark, the framed photo glowing in the lamplight. 5 parts left. The worst was yet to come. Laura's taillights faded down the street, swallowed by the Portland drizzle. The house was silent now, a mausoleum of our past. I didn't chase her. She wasn't worth it anymore. Her suitcase had been half-packed, clothes spilling out like her excuses. She'd left her sketchbook on the counter, the one with my cold-eyed portrait. I flipped through it, then tossed it into the fireplace. The flames ate it slowly, curling the edges black. Felt right. I sat in the living room, the framed photo of her and Eric staring down at me. It wasn't enough, not yet. She'd run, thinking she could escape, rebuild somewhere else. She didn't know I'd already torched her bridges. Mark called as the clock ticked past midnight. She's at a motel off 82nd, he said. Eric's still MIA. Victor's hunting him. I thanked him, my voice steady. Laura was alone now, and Eric was a ghost. Perfect. The next morning I went through her studio. Canvases leaned against the walls, half-finished dreams she'd never reclaim. I found a locked box under her desk. Cheap metal, easy to pry open with a screwdriver. Inside were letters, handwritten, from Eric. Gushing, needy notes about their future. Promises to leave the city together once he sorted things out. Dated weeks ago, while she'd been cooking me dinners and swearing fidelity. My jaw tightened. I photographed every page, then burned the originals in the backyard, the smoke blending with the fog. I called Victor again, using the burner. She's got no cash left, I said. He's running on fumes. Check the motels. Victor growled something in Russian, then hung up. I didn't care what he did to Eric, just that it hurt. Laura would feel it too, the ripple of her lover's collapse. I spent the day at work, drafting blueprints with a focus I hadn't felt in months. Colleagues noticed, said I seemed back to normal. I smiled. Normal was a mask now. That night I tracked her phone, still active, still mine to monitor. She'd moved, checked into another dive across town. Running, but not far enough. I emailed her entire contact list from an anonymous account. Collectors, critics, friends. Attached were the photos, her and Eric in the park at the cafe, plus scans of his letters. Subject line, asterisk, Laura's true colors. Asterisk, no message, just the evidence. Let them judge her. Let her world crumble. Friday dawned gray, the city wrapped in a damp shroud. Laura called me at 8 a.m., her number flashing on my screen. I let it ring, sipping coffee as her voicemail pinged. Daniel, please, she sobbed. Everyone's turning on me. What did you do? Her voice broke, a mix of rage and despair. I didn't call back. She'd figure it out soon enough. Mark met me for lunch, his cop face grim. Victor found Eric. Beat him bad, broke his hands. He's in a hospital downtown, won't talk. I nodded, picturing Eric's smug grin replaced by bandages and bruises. His hands, his sculptor's tools, ruined. Poetic. Laura's a mess too, Mark added. Motel kicked her out. No money. I thanked him, slipping him another 50. He didn't ask where it was going. He knew better. I drove by the gallery that afternoon, the one that had canceled her show. A sign in the window read, * new artist showcase. * her name was gone, erased like a bad sketch. I stopped at a florist next, buying a dozen roses, red, her favorite. I had them delivered to her last known motel, with a note, * for your fresh start. D** cruelty wrapped in kindness. She'd hate it. Back home I cleaned, scrubbed the kitchen, vacuumed the rugs, erased her presence. The framed photo stayed my trophy. My phone buzzed. Texts from mutual friends, shocked, asking if it was true. I replied vaguely, * she made her choices. * let them fill in the blanks. By evening, her art circle was buzzing. Posts on X from critics I'd tipped off, calling her unreliable, a liability. Her reputation was ash. I cooked steak, rare, and ate alone. The house felt lighter, mine again. Laura was out there, scrambling, but she'd hit walls soon. I'd made sure of it. Saturday I escalated. Laura's bank account, ours technically, was still joint. I logged in, drained it, transferred every cent to a new account she couldn't touch. She'd been living off it, borrowing from Eric's mess. Now she had nothing. I pictured her at an ATM, card declined, panic setting in. A small victory, but it stung her where it hurt. Mark called midday. She's crashing with a friend, some painter downtown. Eric's out of the hospital, disappeared again. Victor's pissed. I thanked him, then contacted the friend, Claire, a naive watercolorist Laura had mentored. I texted her from a burner, * Laura's trouble. Check her history with Eric. She'll drag you down. * attached a photo of Eric's letters. Claire wouldn't risk her own career. Laura'd be out by nightfall. I visited a storage unit I'd rented weeks ago, under a fake name. Inside were boxes, her art, her supplies, things she'd left behind. I told her I'd handle it when she moved out. She thought I'd trash them. Instead, I'd saved them for this. I loaded a few canvases into my car, drove to a pawn shop, and sold them cheap. The owner didn't care about her signature, just the frames. Her work, her soul, reduced to $20 each. That night, I hacked her email. Her password was still our anniversary. Pathetic. I sent a mass message to her remaining contacts. * I'm stepping back from art. Personal issues. Sorry. * signed her name. She'd wake up to an empty inbox, her last ties severed. I poured whiskey, watching the rain streak the windows. The framed photo gleamed, a silent witness. Sunday, Laura hit bottom. Mark texted, * she's at a shelter. Claire kicked her out. No one's taking her calls. * I pictured her in a cot, surrounded by strangers, her pride shredded. Eric was still AWOL. Victor's men had scared him underground. I didn't care where he was. His part was done. I drove downtown, parking near the shelter. Not to see her, just to feel it, the weight of her fall. The streets were slick, neon signs reflecting in puddles. I stopped at a diner, ordered pie, and listened to the chatter. A guy at the counter mentioned that artist chick who'd lost everything. Heard she was shacked up with some loser, he said. I smiled into my coffee. Word traveled fast. Back home, I packed the last of her things. Clothes, trinkets, a necklace I'd given her years ago. I mailed them to the shelter, no note. Let her choke on the memories. Then I called a realtor. Selling the house, I said. Fast. It was tainted now, every beam a reminder. I'd start over, somewhere new, free of her shadow. That night I smashed the framed photo. Glass shattered, the image tearing across their faces. I swept it up, dumped it in the trash. Closure of a sort. Laura was a husk. Penniless, friendless. Her art career dead. Eric was broken, hiding. My revenge was complete, but one thread remained. Monday, March 3rd, 2025. The date stuck with me. Exactly 1 year since I'd designed our anniversary trip, before it all unraveled. I woke early, the house empty, the realtor's sign staked in the yard. My new apartment lease started tomorrow, smaller, cleaner, mine alone. I felt lighter, unburdened. Mark called. Laura's still at the shelter. Eric surfaced, caught trying to skip town. Victor's got him again. I nodded, unsurprised. They'd destroyed each other, just as I'd planned. I thanked Mark, told him to take care. He'd been my anchor. Now I'd sail solo. I drove to the river, the Columbia's currents swirling gray. I tossed the burner phone in, watching it sink. No more calls, no more strings. Laura might claw her way back someday, but not as the woman I'd known. Her name was poison now, her canvases landfill fodder. Eric's hands would never sculpt again. They'd paid dearly. At the office, I finished a blueprint. A sleek, modern house, all sharp lines and open space. It was me reborn. I smiled genuinely this time. Revenge hadn't healed me, but it had freed me. The past was rubble, and I was walking away.